I think you make an important distinction between military preparedness, which, as you say, is something that most major powers are engaged in this idea of national war preparedness. But I wonder if perhaps your conclusions aren't a little too reassuring. Let me ask it in two ways. One, you argue that leadership, in order to actually be prepared to go to war, would have to mobilize public support and bureaucratic support to an extent that it hasn't done already. So the first question is, well, how important are those really in a system in which power is as heavily concentrated as it clearly is in the Chinese system? And then secondly, when you go through the list of things you mentioned that leaders would have to do in order to mobilize the necessary support, it seems to me that many of these things have already happened or are happening to a degree. National leader reprioritizes goals. Well, the downgrading of economic development in recent years seems to answer to that description. Calls for mass sacrifice, the use of references to eating bitterness, purges. Well, there's sort of been an ongoing purge of sorts as long as Xi Jinping is around. Popular culture, my understanding is that the most popular movies in China in recent years have portrayed China's struggle against the United States in the Korean War. So I wonder if this preparedness is not simply binary, but a matter of degree, and where, in fact, what we've been seeing are progressive steps closer to being at that point than perhaps we were 5 years ago or 10 years ago. I wonder if you'd respond to that.
Thank you, Dr. Friedberg, and good to see you as well. So in terms, I'll start with the second question first. I do agree that there are degrees. It is not purely binary. And although I disagree on how much of what is going on in China really correlates with a strong form of that, I do not deny there are steps moving in that direction. There has been a minority of media that depict conflict with the U.S., mainly that one film about the Korean War and a Wolf Warrior series of movies that depicts a clearly American evil mercenary fighting the Chinese, which was popular in China. But this is quite different, orders of magnitude different than what we saw in the Korean War, where you had, large numbers of films cranked out that demonized the U.S. and whipped up propaganda against America. Without question, there's tensions between U.S. and China, but American culture, American people are not hated in China, it's my understanding, like they were perhaps in the Cold War. So there are some moves in the media. Xi's speeches, again, orders of magnitude different from the Cold War, where Mao lambasted the U.S. in the most harsh terms. Think of North Korea rhetoric. That's what it looked like in China in the 50s and 60s. And that was a government that was clearly viewed the U.S. as an enemy and was getting their people ready for war against the U.S. That is not the case today. Xi Jinping criticizes the U.S. But he does not call for mass sacrifice and people to die for their country in the way that Mao did. On the contrary, we saw in COVID, the government went to great lengths to try to minimize loss of life because they feared the repercussions on the CCP's legitimacy. So, I think it's important to state that although there are steps moving in that direction, we are, I think, headed, unfortunately, in a direction where tensions are growing and the Chinese are finding some incentive to consider reprioritization of their goals. And again, I do not think that they have abandoned national development as their priority. That is the top priority. Xi Jinping has not stopped that. We should not overstate that, how much has moved that way. All that is to say, it is important, in my view, for us to balance our policy towards China to both protect our own interests and not unnecessarily drive them in a direction of hostility that can make these trends even more alarming. And then in terms of your first question, you mentioned, I'm sorry, I wrote a word down, but I can't read it. Can you just give me a quick word about the first question? Sorry, you're muted.
I was asking to what extent in the Chinese system it really is the case that the attitudes of people low down in the bureaucracy or people on the street really are going to have an impact on the leadership when it comes to decisions about war and peace.
Well, the precedent for China is that it matters a great deal. We've seen throughout the past 7 decades of CCP rule, anytime a leader has tried to change the policy direction in a significant way, there has been a great struggle in the party for control of all levers, and they only successfully transitioned to a new policy agenda after that transition had been carried out. The last time this happened was in the 70s and 80s when Deng Xiaoping and his market-friendly reformers wanted to get away from Maoism, Mao's agenda, and it took him well over a decade to complete that transition. Chen Yun resisted right up to 92 before he was finally driven out. And in my view, the consensus in the leadership, one reason why Xi Jinping's rule has been stable is that the elites agree with him that although national security is growing in importance, economic development is still a top priority, and there is no support at all for elevating war as a priority above those things. So Xi Jinping understands where the middle is and where the consensus is, and he has stayed in that, although he has moved slightly towards security.
Okay, thank you very much.
Dr. Heath, I want to follow up on your exchange with Commissioner Friedberg, and as he acknowledged, I also appreciate the distinction that you draw between military preparedness and war preparations and war mobilization. But I wonder, as he posed the question to you, whether the approach could be more progressive and incremental. As you describe it in your testimony, the shift would be a radical redirection of the country's political agenda from this decades-long focus on economic development and performance and growth to a war footing. I actually alluded to your testimony this morning during one of our earlier panels and offered up your description of the bureaucracy, which has not been conditioned, prepared, or incentivized to focus on these sorts of security initiatives. Instead, have been incentivized and prepared and conditioned to focus on just that economic development, growth, and the like. In response, and I don't want to put words in those witnesses' mouths, but my takeaway was they seem to say that security is becoming the priority. In striking this dynamic balance between security and growth, security is now becoming the priority. So if that's the case, are you seeing this incremental shift towards security trumping economic development and growth? And as such, would it no longer have to necessitate a radical redirection?
Thank you, Commissioner Goodwin. Very good question. And I agree that security is definitely moving up in priority, although the overwhelming focus is still on national development. And I do not see evidence that despite the increased importance placed on security, that the bureaucracy is in a posture of prioritizing actual war preparation. And let me just add that all this discussion makes me think that in some ways the purpose of this panel, or at least as I understood it, focusing on high-end war, it's not a straw man, but it is such a high threshold that if we're looking for indicators of that, I don't think it's there. But I worry about different kind of conflict, not high-end conflict of tanks and airplanes and missiles, but a more soft conflict, cyber, political, economic, and there, I think the indicators for something happening there are much more alarming, and part of that has to do with the fact that both the U.S. and China are much more vulnerable in the economic, political, and ideological and cyber domains. And part of it is that there is quite a intense acrimony and not quite hostility, but certainly trending in that direction. That's quite alarming. So if we set aside the question of preparations for high-end war, which again I reiterate, I do not see the Chinese preparing for a high-end war, and we just look at this other issue of vulnerability to political interference, economic warfare, cyber intrusion, all that kind of activity, then the picture is very different. And there, the government bureaucracy is being told they need to defend against that. They need to learn how to deal with that and build capabilities for that. And there is evidence that they are doing more and more against us in those domains. So I agree with you, and I think this is part of the issue that we've been wrestling with in the last few questions is we know the Chinese are doing a lot of things against us, and they are. And yet you hear me saying they're not getting ready for war. But the answer to that, in my opinion, is to distinguish between high-end combat, which I again reiterate, I see very little evidence that they're preparing for that, and then lower intensity type, softer forms of the conflict, which I would agree is well underway and intensifying.
Thank you.